Hi, 7th grade. Today you're going to be watching a screencast and it's going to focus on sourcing and also identifying what is a primary source versus a secondary source and what makes a source reliable. This video is required of all students. You will have multiple choice questions on the video and also short answer responses. Your goal is to get 80% of the questions correct. You are able to redo the video, but I will have to reset it. This is serving as a study guide to prepare you for the assessment that's happening this week. The first thing we're going to do is focus on a source. A source can be anything in history, right? It depends what you're studying and what your question is. But sources do contain important historical informations, and they help us and inform us about the past or a topic that we're studying. Sources are used as clues. There's many sources, and eventually you're going to have to figure out which sources are the best to use, because they are going to be unreliable sources, reliable sources, or sources that are corroborated or non-corroborated. Sources can be remains, paintings, speeches, writings, a photo, an object. It could be a book. It can be a table. If you're studying the life of Jews in the Holocaust, you can look at pictures of that time. You can look at their homes, right? You can look at the uniforms that they were given. So when you study history, you're always going to be looking at different types of sources, both primary and secondary. A primary source comes from that period. That's the one thing you have to remember. If the source was created at that time period, then it's a primary source. If we look at, for example, American history, if we want to study the life of George Washington, and you read his journal, that's a primary source. If you go to a museum and you're able to see his clothes, that's a primary source. It was created at that time. If you see the rifle that he used, primary source. A painting created at that time, primary source. Primary sources tend to be pretty narrow, right? Because they only focus on the life of one person or two people or a small group of people, right? They're really narrow in that sense where it only focuses on a very specific topic. Primary sources, the big idea is they come from that period. And sometimes primary sources can be biased because it is the idea of one person, right? The person creating the source. So a primary source is a source that comes directly from the period being studied, something created during that period. For example, the diary of Anne Frank, this is a primary source, right? She was a young girl in the 1930s and 40s who was a Jewish girl, and she was put in a concentration camp. Before she was put in the concentration camp, she wrote a journal about her experiences as a Jewish person in Germany. This is a primary source because if you want to study World War II and how people were treated, this is a good source. It shows you the pain and the suffering that they went through. Okay, so this will be a primary source. Again, the limiting factor here is that it only focuses on her. Do we know that every Jewish person was treated like her? No, we don't. We don't, simply by just this journal, right? They were treated a lot like her because we have other sources that support her experiences. Okay, a secondary source interprets and analyzes primary sources. For example, if I write a book about Anne Frank, and I incorporate what I learned from her journal, my book will be a secondary source because one, I wasn't there, right? Two, I wasn't there. That's the big idea, right? If you're not there to experience the events and you write about it, it's a secondary source. If I write about the treatment of Japanese Americans in the internment camps in the United States, and I read letters and I look at pictures and I try to explain what it must have been like, the book that I create is a secondary source because I'm not actually there. I'm just going based on what I've learned. Okay, so a secondary source interprets and analyzes primary sources. Secondary sources are made after the event. So this is really big, sorry. This is really big, right? Secondary sources are made after the events being discussed. Secondary sources also analyze other secondary sources. So if I'm trying to learn about the Japanese internment camps, I'm not going to just look at pictures of that time or journals. I'm also going to read what other people have written about this topic. Secondary sources also analyze secondary sources. Examples of secondary sources are textbooks, biographies, and encyclopedias. Okay, so here we focus on sources, primary and secondary. If a source is reliable, that means that you can trust this source, right? Because they are pretty much informing you. They're not trying to convince you. That's why you always want to find the news that is the most reliable. They're not trying to convince you of something. And it's really hard in today's time because everybody kind of has an agenda, right? Everybody's trying to convince you of something. But you're trying to find sources that just give you the facts. Just give it to you straight and not try to convince you of something. Reliable sources are ones that you can trust to inform you. And there's ways to figure out what is a reliable source and what is not a reliable source. Okay? Reliable sources tend to be supported by other sources. If you find a source that is not supported by anyone, then you might want to reconsider that source. Right? Reliable sources also have strong evidence. The reason for creating this source is also a hint of why is it reliable or not reliable, right? If they are trying to inform you, it tends to be more reliable. If they're trying to convince you of something, it tends to be an unreliable source. An unreliable source is a source that you really can't trust. And there's ways to figure out what source might be unreliable, right? The reason for creating the source is very important. And you'll see some examples in a second. And unreliable sources also tend to have very loaded language, like great, amazing, bad, like these words that are very opinion-based. Okay, I'm going to write opinion-based. Right? Unreliable sources tend to be very opinion-based. They tend to have a lot of emotion embedded in them. And you'll see some examples in a second. Right? Bias, when you are biased, you tend to favor one side. You tend to take sides and not consider the other side. Biased sources tend to favor one thing or be against something else, person or idea, usually in a way that's unfair, right? A source that is biased, again, tends to use language that is very loaded. So biased and unreliable sources, they kind of go hand in hand, right? They're really kind of connected. To corroborate means to agree. If a source agrees with another source, they are corroborating evidence. When a source supports another source, they are corroborating evidence. Do they have to have the same exact language? They have to say exactly the same thing word for word? No, they don't. Corroborating evidence is good to figure out if a source is reliable or not. If a source is not corroborated by other sources, that's a problem. So you might want to reconsider that source because you want to find sources that are supported by many sources. Okay? The big thing here is a primary source is created at that time, being studied, and it's more limiting. It's more limiting. And you also have to consider, is there bias in this source? When this person created this source, were they showing any bias? Examples of a primary source are the ancient pyramids of Egypt, even though, I mean, they're really big, but it shows you what it was important, right? The Colosseum in Rome, Napoleon's house. Napoleon was a French, he was like a French soldier, eventually became a dictator, a king. If you want to study Napoleon and you want to focus on primary sources, you will focus on his birth certificates, you will focus on his writings, his poems. You might focus on his weapons that he used, the cannons that he used. So those are all primary sources. A secondary source is something that is created after the fact. Wasn't there, right? If I write a book about Napoleon, my book will be a secondary source. My book might have some primary sources in them to help you understand, but the book that I create, my analysis will be a secondary source because I wasn't there. Here are some examples. I know you guys did this already, but this is really good review. Let's look at a couple one. An original World War uniform worn by your grandfather. That's a primary source because it comes from World War I. Okay. Now, if someone writes an article about the uniform, that article will be a secondary source. The article was not created at that time. Here's a couple more. Let's see this one. Let's look at this one. A YouTube video describing how the pyramids were built. It's a secondary source because that YouTube video was not created during the pyramids, when the pyramids were being built. Now, if we find a document from ancient Egypt describing how the pyramids were built, that document is a primary source, right? It's like the information on how to create a pyramid. That'll be a primary source. Here we go. We spent quite a bit of time on this one, and some students were being pulled for running records, so here we go. So how reliable are these sources, right? Few industry article, so an article by the people that own gasoline and oil, saying that global warming is not caused by fuels, by fossil fuels, by oil. This article is very biased because you have to understand who made it. The people that are going to lose money if fossil fuels or oil is eliminated. So you can't trust this article because it is very biased. There's a reason why they made it. And I guarantee you they're going to be very biased. They're not going to focus on the negative aspects of how oil impacts climate. Same thing with this one. Cigarette companies stating that cigarette smoke does not cause cancer, right? This is a very biased article, simply because what are they going to say, that it does cause cancer? Because if they say that, then they're going to lose a lot of money, right? At one point in American history, there was cigarette companies saying there's no connection. Obviously, they're going to say that. It's a very biased. Even though they might have scientists and doctors there, those scientists and doctors cannot be trusted. Why? Because it's their job to support the company, right? It's not the best thing that they're doing, but they're doing a job for their employee. It's very similar to the picture of the child labor you'll see in a second, right? An article written by five scientists from different universities stating that humans could cause global warming. This is a more reliable source because they are from the universities. There are 5 of them, and they do come from different universities, right? And hopefully, and I mean, just because there are 5 scientists from different universities doesn't mean that this is the most reliable, right? You still have to read it and understand, is this being supported by other sources? So you still should have some skepticism. You should still think, can I trust this source? We did this one before. There's a picture that I showed you guys. A photograph of animal abuse paid by PETA. PETA are the people that protect animals, right? This is a biased source simply because PETA is an organization that fights against animal abuse. So the photographer is obviously it's not the most reliable because he is trying to make PETA happy, okay? Statements of a 4-year-old interviewed by police after he saw a car accident. Now, this source is not biased, it's just unreliable because of the age of the kid. Okay, that's the only reason it's unreliable, not because he's biased. Now, if the kid was 15 years old and one of the people that was involved in the car accident was his dad or mom, then this person will be biased because they're going to try to protect their parent, most likely. We'll skip that one. So here are some examples of corroborate. Corroborate means to agree, right? In this middle picture, we see this guy. It says, I was at home with my mom. And the mom says, it's true. He was. She is corroborating that evidence, but the police should think, she is corroborating, but she's also biased because she wants to keep her son out of prison. Okay? So, so this one, I created the sentence, the Star Wars ride at Disneyland is amazing. Many people corroborate this claim, meaning that a lot of people agree with this claim. Here is reliability. Reliable means that something is trustworthy. You can trust it. If there's a car accident and someone sees the car accident and they interview him and he's like, yeah, I saw everything. But then the police discover that this person wears glasses, they're going to say, well, you're not a reliable witness because you obviously wear glasses and you didn't have them at that time. Okay, if he wasn't wearing them at the time. In this case, would you call yourself a reliable witness? And this guy says, who said that? Obviously, this person's not reliable because he doesn't know where he's at. Like he doesn't know where he's at. Reliable means to be trustworthy. A lot of these words are connected. Reliable, corroborates, bias. A lot of them are connected, right? You cannot be a reliable source if you are biased. It's just that simple. For example, if you go, sometimes people get pulled for court duty, jury duty, and they ask you questions. They ask you questions that show if you're a biased person against whoever the defendant is. If the defendant is a person of color, they're going to ask you questions. Have you ever had any incidences with people of color? Because they want to see if you're a biased juror. Because if you're a biased juror, you're going to be eliminated. Bias simply means only focusing on one side and disregarding the other side. Bias is pretty interesting. Okay, evaluating sources. We did this in class as well, and a lot of this you've done already, but this is just a review. So the historical question is, who was present at the Declaration of Independence? Which of these is the best source? And the answer to this is this one. Because he or she is a historian, published in 1999, which is fine, right? It's 200 years after the Declaration of Independence, but he's a historian. The reason why A can be it is because when you go to the movies are not meant to be historically accurate. They can do whatever they want, right? If you write a paper, if you're writing a paper in college and you say, well, I saw it in a movie, like they're gonna give you an F, because the movies are meant to be entertaining. They're not meant to be historically accurate. Even when it's a documentary, right? They still can put stuff in there, so you have to just be careful with that. But documentaries are pretty solid. This one, what was life like in South Carolina? Interview with a former slave in 1936. The person doing the interview is a black man collecting oral histories. The interview with a former slave. So these are the same. The interviewer is white. And with my class, we did pick this one because the interviewer is a black person. And the person that is giving the interview is most likely more comfortable speaking his or her mind here, right? Because number two, the issue is not the white person. The issue is, how does the former slave feel? And he or she is willing to speak his or her truth. That's the only reason why one was selected. For this one, what was the layout of the Nazi concentration camps in Auschwitz? We picked this one. This one is a problem because there's no way this person would have known the whole layout. They just wouldn't have known the whole layout. It was highly controlled. So this is not the answer, by the way. It was highly controlled. There was no way. And it happened about 40 years. The interview happened 40 years after the camp was liberated. This one, someone said, well, this can be biased. Well, why would it be biased? Right? There's no reason for them to be biased. It's just a map that they created for themselves. Why were the Japanese Americans put in internment camps? Government film explaining. So this one is not the correct answer, and here's why. This one is propaganda, right? They're not going to tell you the truth there. They're going to just say, we're protecting the United States from the Japanese. The correct answer was this one. Government report declassified of why it happened. So this one's actually going to give you the truth. This one's going to give you most likely propaganda, like fake news. Did American soldiers commit atrocities or crimes? Atrocities means crimes during the Vietnam War. Speech by an American general touring the United States in 1969 is going to be a biased source. It is a primary source. And here's what I was trying to tell you before. That second one is a primary source, but it is a very, very biased source, right? He is an American general, and we're fighting a war in Vietnam at that time. The correct answer is this one, a sworn testimony. It's still a primary source, but because it's a sworn testimony to Congress, they can't really lie. And if they lie, they can go to jail for it, okay? What happened at the Battle of Little Bighorn? This was a war in the 1800s. I'm gonna sneeze. Oh, sorry. Thank you. What happened at the Battle of Bighorn? The newspaper account from that day after the battle, this is going to be a biased source because the newspaper's taking the American side. The history textbook is not the most, it's not the juiciest, not the most interesting, but it will focus more on both sides. Okay. There was another page that I needed here, but it's not on here. Okay, for this one, I did a drawing for this one. So there's a fight. There was not a fight, but there is a conflict between the Panthers versus the Bears. Right? It's the football teams. The Bears locker room was destroyed the night before, and the Bears are blaming the Panthers. They're like, you guys did it. The Panthers' sister, one of the sisters of the Panthers player's sister, she's like, no, we didn't. They couldn't have done it because we were at the pizzeria. I took them to the pizzeria, right? The problem with this is that she's a bias source. She's a bias source because she wants to protect her brother who's in this team, the Panthers. And then there's the Bears. The Bears, I think it's the running back. The running back, he says, but I saw the Panthers at the pizzeria. The Bears say that, right? He is more reliable because why would he lie about the opposing team being in the pizzeria? Now, if the Bears running back has said, if he said, yeah, they did it, what evidence does he have, right? But the fact is that he is saying that he saw them at the pizzeria, so that makes him a more reliable source. Okay, that's what these focus on. We did this on Friday as well. Justin and Max get into a fight. And we need to know who did it, right? Justin says that Max did it. Max said that Justin did it. And account C, Jamie. Jamie is an important one. Jamie is a student who has classes with Max and Justin right before lunch. And Jamie said, I wasn't in the cafeteria today. This is really important. That's where the fight was supposed to have happened. So Jamie didn't see it. And I'm not friends with any of these guys, but I've seen Max and his friends be mean to Justin in the hallway in class when the teacher isn't looking. Not physical or anything, but like say jokes under their breath and then laugh and stuff like that. They make him uncomfortable. So a lot of students said that Max did the fight. But you can't prove it based on this. You can prove that Max is kind of mean to him, but you can't prove who really did it. Okay? Based on these three accounts, can you prove who started the fight? The answer is no. Right? And here you have to explain why not. Because Jamie is the most trustworthy. I think it's about trust. Maybe that much. Trustworthy. But didn't see who started the fight. That's the reason why you can't figure it out. What does each account say about how Max and his friends treat Justin? So so this guy says terrible. This is bad. Right? Account B, what does he say? What does he say how he treats him? He's like, no data. Right? They kind of think he doesn't say how he treats him. Okay? I'm going to skip here. But Jamie's account does build a stronger case. Right? But Jamie's account can't really prove who started the fight. Then we get to this one here. We did this one. We're not going to go into this one, but we did focus on this one. This one is a really important document. You are going to have something similar like this in your assessment. But you have to understand the context. So this is child labor, right? Kids working. But there's a couple issues here. Hein was paid to take this photograph by an organization that opposes child labor. As a result, it can't be trusted, right? because the question is asking, the question is, there was a question here. Okay, let's go back. The photograph shows the breaker boys in Pennsylvania and coal mine in 1911. Their job was to break coal from larger rocks. The photograph was taken by Lewis Hine, who traveled around the country of kids working. Okay, which one of three facts might cause you to question the reliability of Hine's photograph of the working conditions? The question is not asking if kids were working, because obviously they were, but the conditions that they were in. We don't know if he went and picked out the kids that were the youngest. Maybe these were the youngest. Maybe, we don't know. We don't know if he went and looked for the kids that were the skinniest, the kids that had the most dirt on them, right? That's what makes it unreliable, because he was being paid by people that opposes child labor. This is what we wrote. Fact one might cause me to question the reliability of Hine's photograph because the photographer was paid by an agency that speaks out against child labor. The photograph is a biased source because of who is paying the photographer. Here we could elaborate it on, maybe he picked the skinniest kids, maybe he picked the youngest kids, maybe he picked the dirtiest kids, because he wants to make his employer happy. He wants to make the people that are paying him happy, because that's his job. It's similar to this, guys. It's similar to the doctors, right? Well, where are the doctors? It's similar to these doctors that I focused on before, right? These doctors are not reliable, or scientists are not reliable, because they are trying to make the cigarette company happy. Same thing with the fuel industry. I'm sure they have scientists in there, right? But they are biased because they're trying to make the fuel industry, the bosses in the fuel industry happy. Okay, for your assessments it'll most likely happen on Wednesday. You will be asked what is reliable, what's corroborates, and so forth. Everything on this video, and you're also going to have a primary source. Is it a reliable source? And here's why is it reliable, or here's why it's not reliable. You have options to pick from, but you'll have to explain those. Again, your goal today is to get 80%. If you don't, please let me know and I will reset your video, okay? There is a worksheet attached to this video on bias that you will work on after you finish the video. So let me know.